It's easy to get lost in the seedy underbelly of ancient cities. Just ask the many people who have made careers doing exactly that. When most people hear the words Roman prostitute, they imagine scandalous scenes straight out of a badly researched movie. But the truth is, the day-to-day life of Ameritrix, as they were called, was far less glamorous and often more about surviving than seducing. Ancient Rome was a place where nearly everything could be turned into a business, and intimacy was just another trade, regulated, taxed, and even advertised. Prostitutes could be found in brothels, taverns, bathhouses, and even street corners. Some were enslaved, forced into the trade by their owners, while others were free women who registered their occupation with the authorities, sometimes just to avoid legal trouble. The Roman state wanted its cut of the profits, so working women paid a special tax called the vectigal ex capturis. No tax form has ever been exciting, but this one really killed the romance. Imagine filling out paperwork after a night out on the town, trying to remember the sum total of your earnings and then having to explain where that money came from. To make matters worse, if a woman was injured on the job, she didn't get workers' comp. Instead, her earnings for that day went directly to the emperor's treasury. The business of sex was good business, but it was risky. Prostitution was technically illegal in Rome, but the law turned a blind eye to the activities of women who engaged in it. In fact, there were rules about how prostitutes were allowed to dress, what they could charge, and where they could work. They had to wear distinctive clothing so customers knew what they were getting and couldn't set up shop anywhere they wanted. Designated areas were established throughout the city to keep prostitution from being, quote, offensive to the public morals. If you were a Roman man looking to spice things up with a prostitute, you weren't in luck because women couldn't charge extra for additional services. The price was regulated and pretty steep, so the most expensive part of the transaction was usually the cover charge. Some prostitutes worked for wealthy brothel owners, but many were independent contractors, so to speak, paying fees to the state and sometimes to pimps or other middlemen. That meant a lot of time was spent waiting for customers, waiting for business to pick up, waiting for the right moment to strike up a conversation. Mornings might be spent preparing themselves, oiling hair, choosing garments that stood out, and occasionally applying lead-based makeup, which was slowly poisoning them. But hey, beauty standards, then it was off to the baths. Public bathing was a big part of daily life in ancient Rome, and not just for the practical reasons. It was a social event. And like today's spas, a great place to meet people. After scrubbing, scraping, and slapping, prostitutes would cover themselves in oil and scrape that off to remove dirt and dead skin. This was a much more thorough process than the typical Greek or Roman bath, which is why the word strop survives in English today. Not only did it help them look their best, it also gave them a way to exfoliate and collect gossip. Where they bathed mattered too. A public bathhouse was a good spot, but an even better one was the forum, where prostitutes positioned themselves near the public toilets. If you were an elite Roman male looking for entertainment, you could hire a prostitute to attend a party or join you at the gladiator games. A popular spot for brothels was near the forum, close enough to attract politicians and other powerful men. But the exact location mattered too. Brothels in the red light district of the Subura were notorious, but those near the forum were considered respectable. The business of sex was booming in Rome, but like any business, there was stiff competition. The women who worked in the sex industry were some of the most visible in the ancient world, right up there with merchants and street vendors. Prostitution was hard, unpredictable work. Much like today, it wasn't all sex and drugs and rock and roll. It was long stretches of boredom punctuated by brief bursts of activity. Whether you were a high-end call girl or a tavern hostess, you never really knew when business would pick up. And if the customer showed up with an entourage, you wouldn't get tipped much. So it was important to be prepared. To succeed in this line of work, you needed stamina, salesmanship, and a thick skin. The ability to ignore unwanted advances or turn down customers without making enemies was essential. Working girls had to deal with creepy clients, jealous colleagues, pimps, and police, all while trying to stay safe. There were risks that went with the territory, but for many, The alternative was a life of poverty or slavery. It's 6 a.m. in ancient Rome, and your day job is to make money. So what do? Well, here's a little history hot tip. During the days of the Roman Empire, sex work was a legitimate profession, not just for women, but also men. And while we may think of sex workers today as exotic dancers or people working in the adult film industry, in ancient Rome it was everyone from prostitutes to male escorts, prostitutes, dancers, and even those who dressed as hairy wild men and wrestled for the amusement of others. So you're a sex worker in ancient Rome. What does your day look like? Well, let's find out. You wake up before the sun rises because you have to be up early to make the most of your day. As the stalls in the marketplace begin to open and the carts of street vendors rumble over the cobblestones, you make your way to the public bathroom to wash your face and maybe share a room with some other sex workers or fortune tellers. You dress quickly, smoothing down your tunic and making sure your belt is tight. You don't want anyone to know that you're a sex worker, at least not right away. You have to be able to blend in and look like you have respectable work. After all, you don't want to scare off business by appearing disheveled or worse, looking like someone who might rob them in an alley. You've got 2 rooms, one above a tavern and one near a brothel. The tavern keeps you close to the flow of traffic, and the brothel, well, you never know when you might need some extra company. You might share the room with other sex workers, but that can be helpful for business. If you hear someone in the next room has a client, you can join in the fun too. There's no such thing as a quiet room in this city. Not with all the vendors hawking their wares, the bar offloading its waste into the street, the drunken soldiers returning home from the pub, and the fights that occasionally break out in taverns. Not to mention the carts in the street outside your window. Sleep is overrated anyway. Breakfast is a luxury you can't always afford. Maybe a piece of bread with some olives and cheese or watered wine to help you get through the morning. The key is to look like you have money even if you don't. People are more likely to hire you if they think you're worth the investment. If you're lucky, you might even get some fruit. But really, the only thing you need to keep you going is coffee, lots and lots of coffee. Before you hit the baths, you have to make sure you smell good. And I don't mean like flowers and herbs good. I mean like a whole pig was sacrificed to cover up the stench of stale urine, garbage, cooking fires, and everything else the Romans loved to dump in the streets. If you can afford scented oil, you use it. Otherwise, you cover yourself in perfume. Then you head to the public baths where you scrub yourself with a brush, slap yourself with a towel until your skin is red and sore, and scrape the dead skin off your body. This is the place to see and be seen. Here you catch up with your contacts and hear about new opportunities. Plus, it's hot, which means people are willing to pay even more for your services. The baths aren't just for cleaning, they're for business. And as you dry yourself and put on fresh oil, you meet someone who needs a companion for a party later that night. Perfect. Once you're dressed and ready to go, you hit the streets and start looking for work. You stroll through taverns and brothels, past gambling halls and bathhouses, always on the lookout for potential customers. Most sex workers worked by word of mouth or through connections. It wasn't easy to break into the industry, but once you were in, there were steady clients and enough work to go around. Now, if you're a man, you might head to the gladiator school to give the sweaty, exhausted fighters a little diversion from their brutal training. Or maybe you hang out at the chariot races and bet on your favorite team. Chariot racing was dangerous, dirty work, and those who risked their lives driving the chariots needed some cheering up. And as the sun sets on another day in ancient Rome, you head back to your room, exhausted but satisfied. You may not have been a Roman senator, but you made enough money to survive another day in the greatest city in the world. What did you learn? Share your thoughts below. And if you enjoyed this episode, don't forget to stay tuned for more historical tales. Thanks for watching. It's difficult to advertise your services when you're trying to stay anonymous. Just ask any escort or sex worker. But unlike modern advertising, Roman prostitutes couldn't just buy space in the city newspaper, mostly because it didn't exist. The Romans did have public notice boards where people could post announcements, but these were mostly used for official business or for people looking to hire servants. Prostitution was illegal, so prostitutes couldn't advertise themselves openly. This meant they had to get creative. Some prostitutes wore brightly dyed clothing, especially yellows and reds, colors associated with their trade. Other prostitutes wore eye-catching jewelry or distinctive hairstyles. Graffiti served as both an informal review system and a way to spread a name. In cities like Pompeii, walls were scrawled with messages like "Visit Fabia at the corner shop," or "Flavia has the gentlest touch," phrased more poetically in Latin, of course. Even their footwear could act as an advertisement. Some sandals had messages carved into the sala so that when they walked through dust or mud, the words "Follow me" were imprinted behind them. Prostitutes also built relationships with tavern owners who could refer customers in exchange for a fee. A customer might ask the tavern owner for a prostitute, and the owner would direct him to a particular woman, usually one of the many loitering outside. So, a lot of a prostitute's workday was spent hanging out in taverns, brothels, bathhouses, street corners, and other public places, waiting for potential customers to see them, either literally or figuratively. There wasn't really an off switch for this kind of work. To get new clients, prostitutes needed to be constantly on display. And while it sounds exhausting, it wasn't necessarily a bad gig, at least compared to the other options available to women in ancient Rome. Prostitution was one of the few jobs women could legally hold, even if it was technically a crime to be a prostitute. Women typically entered the profession voluntarily, though they might be coerced into it by a male relative who saw it as a good way to make money. Most prostitutes were single, but some were married women who supplemented their income. There were even a few high-end prostitutes who catered to the most elite members of Roman society. They weren't necessarily higher on the societal rungs than the average Roman woman, but they made enough money to support themselves and sometimes their families. And the job came with benefits, or rather compromises. Prostitution was illegal, so prostitutes had to be careful where they advertised their services. However, this didn't mean that they had no legal recourse if someone tried to take advantage of them. If a client brought a prostitute back to his house instead of meeting her in a public place, he was technically committing a crime and she could accuse him of kidnapping. Also, because prostitutes were independent contractors, they could set their own prices. And since there was no accounting for taste, some clients were willing to pay a lot. But for many prostitutes, the benefits of the job didn't outweigh the drawbacks. Not only were they working long and irregular hours, but they also had to deal with the stigma of their profession. Children were taught to stay away from prostitutes, who were often portrayed as immoral and sexually experienced. If a woman was gossiped about by her neighbors, she could end up losing not only her reputation, but her ability to make a living. As one Roman writer put it, a prostitute is someone whose vices are so extreme that even her own mother disowns her. And because prostitution was illegal, prostitutes had no rights. They were arrested frequently and punished harshly, sometimes ending up in the same prison as criminals. So while prostitution was one of the few jobs open to women in ancient Rome, it certainly wasn't the best. For more ways that prostitution is both similar and different to modern times, check out our video on Victorian prostitutes. Or watch this video instead. By midday, the streets of Rome were buzzing, but for many prostitutes, this was a slow period. Wealthier clients were still at their work or political meetings. The working poor had no time or money to spend. So what did prostitutes do during the day? Prostitution was the oldest profession in the world, after all. You'd think that historians would have a pretty good idea of how it worked. But records from antiquity are often incomplete, biased, or just plain scandalous. We've put together what little we can find to give you a glimpse into the daily lives of prostitutes in ancient Rome. The middle of the day was often used for errands, buying food, replacing clothing, or visiting a healer. Some women maintained friendships with other workers in their area, exchanging tips on safe clients, gossip about rival brothels, or simply sharing a meal. Others spent the time maintaining their rooms, changing linens, cleaning, or decorating to make them more appealing. The more upscale the presentation, the more they could charge. But before our sex workers could turn a single lira, they had to deal with inspections. Yes, inspectors. Since the profession was taxed and regulated, local officials sometimes made rounds to ensure everyone was registered. Being caught without proper papers could result in fines or worse, a run-in with the law could ruin an entire day's earnings. When business picked up around the taverns and brothels in the evening, prostitutes were ready for it. Depending on their age, experience, and charm, each woman set her own prices. Those who catered to the wealthy could make a respectable living, at least by the standards of the time. Emperor Nero even reportedly prostituted himself for money, though he probably wasn't setting the rates. In taverns and brothels, customers negotiated with the madams, not the prostitutes, who were generally forbidden to bargain over prices. If a regular asked for something special, like wine or private rooms, the madam would tack on extra charges. For a high-end establishment, the price of a night with a prostitute might have reached 5,000 sesterces, the equivalent of roughly 18 months' wages for a laborer. But the average fee was closer to 2 or 3 modest-sized businesses. It wasn't unusual for a prostitute to serve several clients a night, though the hours were long and the work was exhausting. Sometimes a client would pay for a whole night's worth of companionship, but not necessarily for sexual services. Prostitutes were often expected to cook meals, clean clothes, and entertain their clients in taverns and brothels. Sometimes they even accompanied gentlemen callers on their way home from the baths. Not every prostitute was confined to a room. Some worked the streets or prostituted themselves in public bathrooms. These women might have charged less, but they also risked arrest and abuse from law enforcement and members of the public. Despite the dangers, street work was attractive to many because the competition was fierce in brothels. The job required sex workers to be savvy businesswomen, shrewd negotiators, and master marketers, all while enduring the emotional and physical toll of repeated abuse. It's no wonder some preferred the relative safety of the streets. There, they could avoid the madams, customers, and brothel habitués who often harassed street prostitutes. Some prostitutes found ways to take advantage of the system. They might have turned tricks during the day, then visited a bathhouse and presented themselves as respectable citizens in the evening. Others dealt drugs or participated in illegal activities to supplement their income. If they were lucky, prostitutes might find a wealthy patron who would support them without demanding sex in exchange for the financial support. Though these liaisons were technically considered prostitution, it was at least possible for women in such relationships to maintain their dignity. Sadly, life as a prostitute rarely lasted beyond a woman's 40s, when she was often forced to compete with younger, more attractive workers. Once sex workers aged out of the industry, they had few marketable skills and little wealth to support themselves. Many turned to begging or prostitution in taverns and brothels. But don't think that being a prostitute meant that a woman was doomed to poverty. While many sex workers did live in extreme poverty, others managed to accumulate small fortunes. Prostitution was one of the few ways a Roman woman could earn money without her family's permission, and surprisingly, it was perfectly legal. Sex workers could own property, manage businesses, and even engage in politics. Now watch, how did Romans deal with STDs? Or check out this video instead. Just after the morning rush, the bell above the door chimed, announcing another customer. She hurried over, hoping it was another merchant like the one before. He'd been generous with his time and even more so with his money. But as she approached, she saw it was a soldier. They weren't bad, but they tended to stay only as long as it took to get their trousers down. And with the afternoon stretching before her like an empty purse, she plastered on a smile and prepared for the long haul. The afternoon often brought a mix of customers. There were merchants finished with their morning business, soldiers between shifts, or travelers passing through. Some days there were no visitors at all, and the hours crawled by. Others could be chaotic with back-to-back appointments. Not that she minded, business was good. She was a prostitute, one of many who plied their trade in taverns and brothels in the city. To survive, a woman had to be more than just pretty. She needed to be skilled at hurting men and managing her time. It was a job that demanded constant negotiation, not just with clients, but with pimps and madam, trying to stay one step ahead of the law and the competition. But first, the visitor had arrived. Tall and broad-shouldered, he looked weary. He gestured to the chair by the hearth and she moved to pour him some wine. The tavern was mostly empty, the midday sun making the air thick and still. Even the tavern cat had sought refuge in the shade of a nearby cart. "You look tired," she said, hoping to draw out the visit a little longer. "A bath would do you good." "Aye," he sighed, rubbing a hand down his unshaven jaw. "That it would." Perhaps a little company, too. Her heart sank. This was going to be one of those nights. Still, she poured herself a glass of wine and sat opposite him. She knew better than to push for more. Soon enough, he'd either leave or agree to her terms. Either way, it was always best not to push. Men who came into the tavern expecting something more than company were usually disappointed. She made sure of it. There were ways to tell what kind of man stepped through the door. A merchant tended to have flour on his hands, a farmer, straw. Soldiers were often dirty and reeked of sweat and stale urine. And young nobles liked to parade through the tavern, showing off the latest finery and jewels, though the wealthier ones sent word ahead and the finest prostitutes were sent to meet them. These afternoons were usually slow, which suited her fine. She liked the quiet, the chance to read or practice her lute. Sometimes she'd run a bath and lose herself in the scent of lavender and cinnamon, imagining she was someone else, someone free. A cough rattled in her chest. Damn this life. She thought of her sister, far away in the country, safe from the smoke and the stench of stale waste that clung to the city like a shroud. Her memories of home were fading, becoming a half-remembered dream. The door chimed again, announcing a new arrival. She looked up to see a young man hesitate in the doorway. He looked lost. She beckoned to him, hoping he was a passerby with coin to spare. He hesitated, then came in. "Can I help you?" she asked, forcing a smile. I was looking for somewhere to hide," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're looking for me." He looked around the mostly empty room, his eyes settling on the heavy oak table. "That'll be 5 silver, she said, surprised by her own boldness. He nodded, pulled a purse from his belt, and slid it across the table. She watched him sit heavily in the chair, his shoulders slumped. She poured him a cup of wine and set it on the table. "What brings you here?" she asked softly. He took a sip and shuddered. "Trouble," he said finally. "I need to get out of the city." It wasn't much, but it was honest work. Helping people escape the city and their problems for a little while. For a few silver coins, she could give them a night of distraction, a warm bed, and a cool drink. If they stayed, they could have some fun. If not, she wouldn't force them. After all, a queen needs her court. With the sun setting over the horizon, business began to pick up. The streets were aglow with the light of torches, and the local taverns were packed with boisterous patrons who had been drinking for hours. Evening was prime time. For sex workers like Elisa, the night was just beginning. She stood on a busy street corner not far from the theater district. The flickering light of the shops reflecting in her dark eyes. Tonight she wasn't working the streets, though. She had a steady clientele of wealthy merchants who frequented the bathhouses and brothels in this part of town. She knew them well enough to call them by name, though they would hardly recognize her outside the brothel. In fine clothes, she might pass for a noblewoman, but in her everyday tunic and shawl, she was just another face in the crowd. The advantage of working indoors was that she could work steadily without having to worry about the whims of the elements or the dangers of the night. Plus, the madam took a cut of her earnings, leaving her with just enough money to cover rent and food. She dreamed of saving enough to buy her freedom and open a shop of her own one day, but it would take years of careful saving. For now, she had bills to pay and a roof over her head. Not every sex worker was so lucky. Some had no choice but to work the streets, either because they could unafford the fees associated with working indoors or because they were too young or too new to the city to build up a clientele. Others simply preferred the freedom and higher pay that came with working for themselves rather than for a madam. And some were forced into street work because of the nature of their abilities or disabilities. Blind beggars were often hired by wealthy men looking for a discreet tryst, and many of these men would seek them out after dark. Working at night could be lucrative, but it was also riskier. In the poorly lit areas away from the gas lamps and torches, thieves lurked, eager to relieve sex workers of their earnings and valuables. To stay safe, many workers carried small knives or wore amulets for protection, while others worked in groups. Still, there were dangers that went beyond the physical. Many sex workers found themselves arrested for loitering or for wearing clothing deemed too revealing by the authorities. But for those willing to brave the risks, the evening brought opportunities. As the sun dipped below the rooftops, people of all social classes poured into the streets. Shopkeepers closed up their stalls and artisans headed home after long days at the market or in the workshop. Factory workers, many of whom were women and children, left the mills and warehouses and headed out for the evening. Families took their children out for the night air before bedtime, and all of these people wanted to be entertained. And what better way to enjoy an evening out than with a feast, a play, or a game? Public spectacles were a nightly occurrence in the city, and with the crowds came potential customers. Dozens of workers might gather in the same area, each hoping to attract the attention of the passing nobles, merchants, and artisans. Competition was fierce, and tempers often flared. Arguments broke out over who had the right to work a particular corner or in front of a certain tavern. Sometimes the arguments turned violent, and not infrequently, workers accused each other of stealing clients or of cursing them with the evil eye. But for all the rivalry, there was also camaraderie among the women, born of necessity and shared experience. They knew the dangers that lurked in the shadows, the brutal men who sometimes beat their prostitutes, the jealous pimps, and the cruel laughter of the night watchmen. They also knew the fleeting nature of their profession, the toll it took on their bodies and the scorn it brought from society. So, when the evening was done and the crowds had gone home, they gathered in the dim oil lamp light, sharing stories and gossip and the meager comfort of their shared existence. They were rivals, yes, but they were also sisters in arms, united in their defiance of the darkness. And with the night deepened, they waited for the dawn to break and the cycle to begin anew. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider subscribing and leaving a review. Your feedback helps us create more engaging historical tales. The night is late, the moon is high. The revelers are drunk and stumbling home, but above the tavern in the room you call home, there is no sleep. You are a sex worker in ancient Rome, and your night is just beginning. You start by counting the earnings from the day, then subtract any money owed to the brothel owner or landlord. What's left over you set aside for the tax collector. Then finally, you can count your own earnings. If you were able to save enough, maybe you'll be able to buy your freedom. Or maybe, just maybe, you'll be able to retire from this life and take up something less, how shall we say, demanding. But for most, that dream is just a fantasy. For many, the only way to survive is to return to the only skills they know. So they get ready to do it all again tomorrow. But not so fast. First, you have to get through the night. Some nights the customers don't leave when you want them to. They get drunk and stumble out, talking to anyone who'll listen, spilling secrets they shouldn't and grabbing at the first passerby who looks at them the wrong way. These are the worst nights. Not because of the groping, though that's bad enough. It's because of the stories. They tell the whole city about what they saw and heard in that room above the tavern. Other nights are better, like the nights the rich men come in. They're prepared to pay top dollar for your services and aren't interested in anything scandalous. For them, discretion is everything. You might even get to retire early if you please one of these men. But whatever the night brings, you must be ready for it. And the only way to do that is to follow the rhythms of the city. When the taverns close, the brothel is just opening. As the moon climbs higher in the sky, so does the price of wine. And when the emperor's guards begin their rounds, the street lamps are lit and the revelers come out in force. By the time the sun begins to rise, the streets are dirty and dangerous, but also full of opportunity. And as long as you follow the rhythms, you might just make it through the night and live to work another day. This is Rome, where the emperor is a god, the crowds are wild, and the streets are yours if you dare to claim them. Make it to the end of your shift and you'll earn your freedom. But don't get lost in the debauchery or you might never escape. Thanks for watching.